My name is Barbara Winslow. I'm a professor in the Women and Gender Studies program at Brooklyn College, Shirley Chisholm's alma mater. And I'm also the founder and director of the Shirley Chisholm Project of Brooklyn Women's Activism, and just published a brand new book on Shirley. Only $15 autograph, please buy it, and that's enough about me. We're very excited to have this panel at this conference. And I wanted to begin by saying that when Gloria Steinem accepted the Congressional Medal of Freedom, she told me that she accepted it in the name of Patsy, Mink, Shirley Chisholm, and Bella Abzug. And I have the email to prove it. And so I think it is very fitting that we have this panel and this discussion. Unfortunately, Leandra could not come, but she gave me her paper, and I'm going to read it, because not to have Bella here would not to have the panel. And I will do the best I can to channel Leandra to my best ability. I also am going to be introducing our panelists based upon who got elected first to Congress. So it's going to go Patsy, Mink, Shirley Chisholm, and Bella Abzug. And I'm not giving away the best-held secret about, or one of the many secrets about Patsy Mink. I'm going to let Judy, you want to get up and speak, right? Judy Wu is a professor at Ohio State University. She is also the author of, and technology screwed me up, please name that wonderful book that you wrote.
I wrote Dr. Mom Chung of the Fair-Haired Bastards and Radicals on the Road, Internationalism, Orientalism, Feminism during the Vietnam era.
And we'll be speaking at a panel later on that very subject. Judy?
Am I going first?
Yeah. Well, no, Patsy is.
I'm going to use some visual aids today. I've been doing a lot of research on Patsy Mink, but I haven't had much chance to process it, so what I'm going to be presenting today is a test run. It's a preliminary take on her politics about childcare. So I'm going to read the introduction, and then I'm going to talk through some of these slides and some of these quotes. The title of my topic is Nurturing America's Children, Patsy Mink, and the Politics of Childcare. In 1970, Pat Maynardi of the radical feminist group Red Stockings published a devastating critique of the politics of homework, or housework. She exposed how self-identified radical men dismiss the need to share in household labor. She translates the typical response by male activist partners: housework is too trivial to even talk about. She explains that what he really means is that it's even more trivial to do. Housework is beneath my status. My purpose in life is to deal with matters of significance. You should do the housework. Maynardi points out how these deeply personal practices between couples and families were also deeply political. As she argues in her essay, participatory democracy begins, or ought to begin, at home. My presentation points to another way in which feminist activists of the 60s and 70s sought to redefine the private and the public. In 1967, Patsy Mink, the first woman of color congressional representative, introduced a bill in the House of Congress to provide federal funding for early childhood education. Mink was also the co-sponsor of Title IX. As she reflected in a 1975 speech, that was the first time Congress focused on the need for publicly financed child care programs in America. Now, this is a bit of an overstatement. During World War II and the mid-1960s, there were previous federal efforts to support child care. During the war, providing child care was a temporary measure to recruit American women for defense work. During the war on poverty in the mid-1960s, the federal government supported child care so that low-income parents, especially low-income mothers, might seek vocational training and employment. However, Mink's proposal, which she advocated for during the next decade or so, was unique in two ways. First, she argued for the federal government responsibility to provide child care on a broader and more permanent basis. For Mink, child care should not be an emergency measure, and it should be available to all families regardless of the income of their parents. Second, Mink argued for the need for quality early childhood education. She wanted to advance the educational experience of children beyond what she described as custodial care. Her efforts to pass federal legislation to support ongoing availability and quality of child care held deep significance. As Mink argues, the value of federal legislation, as others before me have pointed out, is not only that it provides a specific program with specific amounts of money, but it represents a national statement of purpose and support. provides the inspiration for action and leadership at other levels of government, thus having an effect far beyond the simple provisions of law itself. So as I mentioned before, this presentation is a preliminary exploration of her campaign for federally funded childcare and early childhood education. So we'll first examine how Mink's interest stems from her personal experiences as a professional woman and from the broad experiences of women of color in Hawaii, her home state. Second, I highlight how the call for childcare dovetailed with the interests of the feminist, labor, and educational movements of the 60s and 70s, both in the United States and globally. Finally, I analyze how Mink's proposal roused such opposition from conservative politicians and members of the public. These critics of federally funded childcare framed their fears concerning government intervention into private family responsibilities in light of domestic as well as global political developments. So just to turn to my first point, thinking about how Patsy Mink's experiences, both personally but also collectively as part of a broader generation of Japanese Americans on Hawaii, shaped her interest in childcare. Hawaii, since the late 19th century, recruited Japanese and other immigrant laborers to the island. They played a crucial role in developing the sugar industry, and in particular, Japanese American women or Japanese women were recruited, both because they could work in the fields, as you can see in some of these pictures. This is how Japanese immigrant women attired themselves to work in the fields. But they were also really recruited because they're reproductive labor. There was a sense that if immigrant men brought their women with them, they would be more docile, they'd be more placid, they wouldn't advocate and agitate. You can see some images of home life in the Hawaiian plantations at that time. Now, having a large presence of Japanese immigrant women among Japanese immigrants more broadly helped reproduce the broader Japanese American community, and Patsy Mink has direct family ties to this particular movement. Her grandfather was recruited to work on the plantation sugar industries. Because women played such an important role both in labor and in reproductive labor, the right of paid maternity leave or reproductive politics was central to the labor movement in the 1920s in Hawaii. So in 1920, there was an island-wide strike in Oahu. 3/4 of the population went on strike, and one of the key demands was paid maternity leave. And that was a key issue of consideration for workers who are in plantation societies. For women who are working in the fields, they often had to think about what do they do with their children as they're conducting this work. This heritage had a direct impact on Patsy Mink herself. When she starts running for office in the 1950s and 1960s, first initially locally and then eventually nationally, she talked about and identified herself as a working mother. She received her law degree from the University of Chicago, but after she graduated, nobody would employ her. Certainly not in the Midwest. When she goes to Hawaii, she even has a difficult time there. So she ends up hanging out a shingle and sharing an office building with her parents. But during that time, when she's trying to develop a political career and develop a professional career, she often had to think about what to do with her daughter. This is Gwendolyn Mink. I think many of you might know her scholarship on welfare, but this is her as a very young child. And she often recalled that her parents would deliberate about where they might live, where they might gain access to childcare, and also to question the type of childcare that Wendy was exposed to. For example, when she first came back from one of these early childcare institutions, she wanted to play with dolls, because that's what girls are supposed to do. Her mother was very concerned that these childcare institutions are reifying traditional gender roles, since they're trying to encourage students to challenge them. When Patsy Mink goes to Congress in the mid-60s, she's elected in 1964, goes in 1965, she's really there as part of a broader sea change in terms of who can become a citizen and whose rights are represented politically in Congress. There's the Civil Rights Act, there's also admission of Hawaii to statehood, and one of the key issues at that time was the war on poverty. How might government resources be utilized to assist disadvantaged populations, underrepresented populations? It was both an issue that was directed towards a particular group, right, disadvantaged children, poor people, but it was also something that was more broadly being reflected in the politics and the economy of the time. This is a statement by the Women's Bureau from 1959-1960, talking about the increasing numbers of women who are entering the workplace. In 1920, 8.25 million women worked outside their homes. Less than 1/4 of them, 23%, were married. In 1960, 23 million women are in the labor force, more than 3/5 of whom, 61%, are married. Labor force participation of married women between 20 and 44 years of age is highest among those whose husbands earn less than $5,000 a year. So you see here this broader change is occurring in terms of women's employment and how women's employment is often connected to class. Along with women entering the workforce, there's increasing need for childcare and childcare support. This is a statement by the Children's Bureau. 1958, the Children's Bureau survey showing that 400,000 children care for themselves while their mothers work. Of these, 13,000 are under 6, under 38,000 are 6 to 9 years old. And in 1967, when Patsy Mink is introducing legislation for federally funded childcare, these are the statistics that they are bringing forth. This is by Mary Dublin Case-Sterling, Director of the Women's Bureau. In 1967, 4 million mothers with children under 6 years old. Existing daycare facilities for only 350,000 children. So this call for childcare both comes from Patsy Mink's very personal experiences, but also is very much connected to this broader changing political economy in the United States in terms of gender, labor, and care work. She was not the only person who's calling for childcare. There are various publications and various organizations. These are just examples of a couple of these. And it's really reflecting a broader feminist politics at the time. Daycare is number 1 on the list of demands for women's rights groups. Childcare is considered by some feminists as a pivotal issue in determining the future course of women's rights. Without daycare to free women and men, they say, you might as well forget about equal pay, equal advancement, and equal opportunity. There was a range of politics about daycare. So this particular publication says the most conservative women's group now, the National Organization of Women, is making, National Association of Women, sorry, Organization of Women, is making an effort to establish free, publicly supported centers. The more radical women's rights groups are adamant about the fact that they feel universal childcare is the responsibility of all society. According to them, the nuclear family is archaic and stifling. Children are not private property. So you see in both of these quotes that childcare can be both a liberal as well as a radical legal agenda. It can be a means to free up women so they might enter the public workforce. It's also a way to fundamentally redefine what it means to be a family. I'll just highlight a few of the legislative efforts that Patsy Mink was engaged in. She introduces this legislation in 1967. She was able to obtain 25 co-sponsors from other legislators. It did not pass. There was a series of hearings, but it did not pass. She introduces it in 1969. There's an increase in co-sponsors. And what the legislation is calling for is $300 million in funds to help advance the quality of education for childcare centers and to develop more childcare centers. Eventually, in 1971, when the legislation is being led by Mondale and Radames in the Senate and the House, it does pass, both Senate and the House. Unfortunately, and also the price tag increases to $1.85 billion. Unfortunately, President Nixon vetoes it after it passes successfully. And these are some of the reasons why it was not passed or it was vetoed. Nixon contended that the proposal would commit the vast moral authority of the national government to the side of the communal approaches to childbearing over against the family-centered approach. Right, this fear of government intervention, of this fear about societal control, as opposed to validating the private spirit of family. And this is what Patsy Mink, how she describes the opposition. The child care program is in serious danger from right-wing attack and threat of veto by Nixon. Right-wing propaganda is to the fact that we are attempting to Russianize our children. I think this phrase is really interesting. It really highlights the Cold War context of these debates. To Russianize our children has lots of implications. One, again, is government control over the family, the public over the private. There's also a fear of secularizing childhood education. And there's also a fear about communist forms of gender roles, right? Having a more equal distribution of productive and reproductive labor. Okay. So I'm just going to end here. I'm thinking about what are some of the implications of studying Patsy Mink and also this particular topic of childcare. I think studying Patsy Mink is a way to rethink who we think as our feminist foremothers. Patsy Mink is the first woman of color congressional representative, but often that title is used to describe Shirley Chisholm, who was elected after Patsy Mink. And I think that has to do with the way we think about race, which is very much along black and white lines, but it's also a way we think about region, to not think about Hawaii as central to American politics. I really want to also highlight the politics of childcare, to think about that as a way to have a better grasp about the changing political economy of American society. And it also highlights the ways in which federal legislative politics is central to feminist politics. Childcare was an issue that was important on the local level, so people organizing childcare, organizing feminist collectives, but it was also very important at the very top, at the state level. And I want to highlight that particular form of activism as well. And then finally, I want to emphasize the connections between the personal and the global. Right? The ways in which we think about childcare can be very much on the intimate realm, it can be in the private realm, within the family. But the politics of family was very much connected to global politics at that time. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Judy. If you remember Sarah Evans' opening presentation, she talked about some of the myths that has to be shattered. And one of the great things about Judy's work is it's shattering the myth that the women's liberation movement hated children, did not take up the issue of child care. And it's very important that we do this. Our next speaker is Zinga Fraser. She is the endowed postdoctoral fellow in women and gender studies at Brooklyn College, my colleague and friend. She is a doctoral candidate in African American studies at Northwestern University, specializing in race, politics, and culture. I'm going to leave some of your stuff out just because I want you to speak more than the introduction. Her work is on Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan. Her dissertation is a comparative study of Barbara Jordan and Shirley Chisholm and Black women's politics in the post-civil rights era. Her work has been published in Souls, Phyllis, Journal of African American History, and the Association of Black Women Historians. Zinga has also worked for the former congressional representative Major Owens from Brooklyn, and served as the U.S. Policy Program Coordinator for the Women's Environmental and Development Organization. She is currently working on an article on Shirley Chisholm and the Black Power movement in the first comprehensive study of the Black Power movement in New York City. Good morning. Good morning.
So my paper is entitled Race, Gender, and Rebellion, Shirley Chisholm and the Women's Movement. Before I get into the body of my discussion on Chisholm and the Women's Movement, in preparation for this talk, I thought about rebellion and what it means for congressional women. Having worked for a congressman, I thought of the few times, really the rare few times, that I saw sheer rebellion in committee meetings, hearings, or markups, floor debates, beyond the yelling, the hand waving, the kind of playground antics instead of comprehensive discussion, right? I wondered how should we reimagine the ways in which congresswomen in the 1970s engaged in everyday and historic acts of rebellion. I was struck by a talk Chisholm gives in 1969 at North Carolina State University, where she declares, "If the time comes when I must choose rebellion between submission, if the time comes when I must choose between submission and rebellion, I must choose rebellion. I don't believe the time has come, but the time is near." Chisholm's discussion about rebellion spoke to the Black student and anti-war rebellions that were taking place at campuses all over the country. Moreover, she articulated students' growing frustrations with the status quo political leadership. Chisholm's discussion of rebellion is also antithetical to the daily operations of Congress that is entrenched in rules, traditions, that inhibits rather than promotes change. While Chisholm's own identity as a Black woman that operates as a physical manifestation of a political rebellion, her strategic decision to rebel within the halls of Congress is what continues to attract her to new generations of activists and leaders, and it's what really attracted her to my work. Even though the Women's Political Caucus has increased since the days of Abzug, Chisholm, and Mink, a number of congressional women today are still engaging in many rebellions. Whether it's walking out on full committee hearings on reproductive rights for not including one woman on its panel, or it's calling press conferences to denounce Republican leadership's racist and sexist questioning of Susan Wright's qualifications for Secretary of the State, there is still a need for women in political offices to rebel. For me, Chisholm provides a playbook for such rebellions. With that said, this morning I want to briefly explore how Chisholm's intellectual and ideological contributions helped to shape the mainstream feminist movement. Along with her political foremothers, such as Ida B. Wells and Anna Julia Cooper, Chisholm attempts to transform American democracy by inserting a radical humanism and intellectual critique that speaks to the universality of oppression while confronting the patriarchy and white supremacy within governmental structures. First, I think it's important for us to place Chisholm within a trajectory of women intellectuals within the women's liberation movement. Oftentimes, Black women political activists have been excluded from scholarly constructions of the intellectual. With the context of the Black power and feminist movements of the 1970s, the iconography of Chisholm as a static representation of a radical has located her outside the knowledge production of the movement. While I agree Chisholm is part of a historiography of radical women, I'm also cautioned by what scholar Joy James' discussion on how the fixation of certain aspects of radicalism, specifically Black women activists, can rob Black women like Chisholm from an intellectual engagement. I argue that Chisholm operates to what scholar Carol Boyce Davis describes as a radically transformative intellectual, where the intellectual practice is organized around the production of knowledge directed at transforming the social context in which we live and operate. If we look at the totality of Chisholm's writings, newspaper columns, she even wrote poems, congressional speeches, books, and position papers, her body of work places her among a number of activist intellectuals who sought to engage political discourses on race and gender. In her column of Feminist Eye, Chisholm wrote that the eradication of sexism would be a longer struggle than racism. It reads, part of the problem is that women in America are much more brainwashed and content with their roles as second-class citizens than Blacks ever were. Pointing to the lack of a gender consciousness of women, she continues, despite all women's effort as organizers and volunteers who were responsible for political victories, but they do not assert their own opinions or vote their conscience. Instead, they follow the cues of male leadership. Chisholm's privileging of gender over racial oppression did not exclude her from identifying the pervasiveness of all oppression. According to Chisholm, any kind of discrimination is indeed anti-human. Chisholm's advocacy of a radical humanism helps to demonstrate why she chose to work with such a diverse constituency of minorities, gays and lesbians, and the poor. Strategically, Chisholm's writings are also connected to her own self-promotion. Her book on Border Navajas allowed her to speak directly to a national audience. As an intellectual, Chisholm writes in a number of places that allow her to engage a diverse constituency. You could pick up a piece of traditional women's publication like McCall's or Miss Magazine and Jet Magazine, as well as kind of radical Black journals like the Black Scholar. All are places where Chisholm strategically places pieces about herself and critiques the movement at that time. So secondly, where Chisholm is most effective in transforming the women's movement was her legislative and political agenda around women's issues, particularly contributing to an ideological broadening of women's legislation, such as Patsy Mink does. Chisholm's stances on reproductive rights, education, and economic disparities spoke to all the failures of economic and governmental infrastructures that were unwilling to support and protect marginalized communities. For example, in a paper to the Nixon administration, who she hated, right? Chisholm writes, this enforcement of welfare reform punishes those who accept aid while creating a society that denies them of all other choices, right? Chisholm's analysis of welfare reform went beyond the fight for increased benefits, but also extended to the institutional culture of federal assistance agencies that demonize poor women, specifically women of color. In her recommendations to Nixon, she calls for the elimination of degrading treatment of recipients, and provisions for suitable work opportunities and the training of welfare personnel to ensure everyone is treated with dignity. Chisholm understood the nuances and concerns of women on welfare, that the issue was not only about equitable treatment, but it was about not only about the distribution of services and goods, but also about equitable treatment. Aware of the stakes that put her support of abortion in opposition with Black nationalists and traditional Black leadership, Chisholm serves as one of the movement's most militant supporters. She was particularly critical of the challenges to abortion and reproductive choice being waged by Black nationalists, that abortion and other forms of birth control were part of a genocidal plot against the Black community. She provides a special order speech entitled Facing the Abortion Question, as well as delivering a keynote speech at Howard University Symposium on Abortion and the Inner City, stating that the current deaths of Black and Puerto Rican women due to the botched abortions were more in the line with genocide. Yet Chisholm continues to expand reproductive rights by not limiting the legislative and political advocacy to safe and affordable abortions, but including the coercion and involuntary sterilization of minority women and girls. Chisholm supports Black feminist assertion that the reproductive rights was inextricably linked to the fight for women of color to assert their own rights of motherhood. Lastly, I would like to place Chisholm and her advocacy within the feminist discourse of the 1970s. Specifically, while white feminists admire Chisholm, and she's mentioned in works for being the first, as well as a participant in the movement, there is a paucity of scholarship that connects Chisholm's role within the women's liberation movement. And I would also input Black power movements, such that Chisholm engages both movements simultaneously. Chisholm's participation in the women's movement went beyond a romanticized view of a united sisterhood. While we are aware of conflicts and disagreements over racism and classism, Chisholm's commitment to participate in mainstream women's movement stemmed from her undying belief and commitment to forming progressive coalitions. Her work in the National Women's Political Caucus and now speaks to the ways in which Black feminists like Florence Kennedy operated as a bridge between radical Black feminists and white feminists. Moreover, Chisholm helped raise white feminists' consciousness about racial and class oppressions. As one of the most valuable Black feminists of her time, Chisholm would also reject a feminist tokenism. She was never a fan of being the only one. She would constantly put leadership to task for the exclusion of women of color. In an interview, Chisholm recalls a conference in which a White Plains National Political Caucus where not one Black or Puerto Rican woman was placed on the agenda. She states, "I have seen too many occasions where they talk sisterhood, but when the time comes to stand up and really exemplify sisterhood, they have got to meet it." She also comes under a critique for her support actually of Patsy Mink for the post of vice chairman for the Rules Committee for the DNC over Yvonne Brathwaite, who becomes elected in 1978, who is a Black congressional woman. And she comes under attack by kind of Black leadership. Even Chisholm's disappointment for not receiving Bella Abzug's full endorsement for her presidential campaign did not stop her from sponsoring a fundraiser for Abzug's campaign against Patrick Moynihan for the U.S. Senate. Chisholm told the New York Times, "Women candidates must help when the candidates raise funds." For Chisholm, increasing the rates of women in politics was paramount. Even when Chisholm leaves Congress, she maintains her commitment to increasing the number of women elected officials. Unlike many men in the civil rights movement, Chisholm is part of a legacy of Black women's political leadership who groomed and provided mentorship and leadership for a young generation of women leaders. Despite her exit from political leadership, Chisholm continued to work with a coalition of women within the Democratic Party. Their success indicates how her legacy of activism and leadership remained even when certain movements dissipated. Chisholm's undeniable political and intellectualism, intersectional approach to legislation, radical humanism, and commitment to women's leadership fulfill the freedom dreams of those who came before and provides a vision today. I leave you with Chisholm's commentary on women in politics, women's roles in politics. Plenty of others have advised me every time I try to take another upward step that I should go back to teaching, a woman's vocation, and leave politics to the men. I love teaching, and I'm ready to go back as soon as I'm convinced that the country no longer needs a woman's contribution. When there are no children going to bed hungry in this rich nation, I may be ready to go back to teaching. When there's a good school for every child, I may be ready. When we do not spend our wealth on hardware to murder people, when we no longer tolerate prejudice against minorities, and when the laws against unfair housing and unfair employment practices are enforced instead of evaded, then there may be nothing more for me to do in politics. But until this happens, what we need is more women in politics, because we have a very special contribution to make. I hope that the example of my success will convince other women to get into politics, and not just stuff envelopes, but to run for office. It is women who can bring empathy, tolerance, insight, patience, and persistence to government. At present, our country needs women's idealism and determination, perhaps more in politics than anywhere else.
When did she make that speech again?
1974.
Has anything changed in terms of the message? As I said, Leandra Zarnow cannot make it. She's ill. But there is good news. She did get a job, tenure track line in Houston. So I will do the best I can to channel her wonderful work. And will you? Yeah, this is the 5 minutes, this is the 1 minute, and then you can tell me to shut up. How we do it, oops. Her paper, have I screwed up? No, is entitled, "We Just Have to Push and Push and Push. Bella Abzug and the Campaign for Women's Liberation Within Electoral Politics." After a decade stumping for unelectable male-dubbed candidates, Bella Abzug threw her hat in the ring, entering the congressional race for Manhattan's 19th district in 1970. A keen political strategist, Abzug calculated, quote, "the renaissance in the born-again women's movement," as she put it, quote, "would provide the necessary boost to her long-standing anti-war base. What assured her congressional win," Abzug reasoned, "was her ability to garner women's swing vote, fostered in part by her natural alliance with feminists." Or so it seemed. Early on, Abzug approached Susan Brownmiller, a freelance writer she knew from Reform Democratic politics in Greenwich Village. And Leandra said I could make a few asides. There's so many connections between these three candidates, it's unbelievable. Susan Brownmiller covered Shirley Chisholm's campaign and wrote the first biography of Mrs. Chisholm, one for middle school children, and it's a wonderful, wonderful book. Abzug approached Susan Brownmiller, a freelance writer she knew from Reform Democratic politics in Greenwich Village. As a member of the newly formed New York Radical Women, Brownmiller was well positioned to compel this and like consciousness-raising groups to come out for Abzug. "I will take the cause of women, America's oppressed majority, to the halls of Congress," quote. Abzug had promised in her March announcement speech, a pledge she believed would directly appeal to all feminists. Accordingly, she was rather taken aback by Brownmiller's cool reception. "They will not support you," Abzug recalled Brownmiller, curtly dismissing. And anybody who knows Susan Brownmiller knows that when she curtly dismisses you, she has curtly dismissed you. One reason Brownmiller apparently gave was Abzug's affinity for lipstick. When recounting this brush-off in a mid-1990s interview, Abzug was not above countering with her own complaint. Radical feminists, she admonished, were reluctant pupils, slow to develop a sophisticated feminist response to the Vietnam War. What can we make of this exchange today? Running for Congress at 50, Abzug's age, her politics of respectability certainly set her apart from the college-educated youth who dominated consciousness-raising groups. But the tendency to draw mother-daughter analogies here skews the focus from the underlying ideological gulf that separated Abzug from Brown-Miller. And so, rather than trace Abzug's bevy of feminist accomplishments today, I would like to explore this point of disconnect by briefly spotlighting her work before Congress. Bella Abzug was a radical, not just of the same making as Brown-Miller. Her politics were born from three formative experiences. First, Abzug's early religious devotion to conservative Judaism and an influential Talmud Torah teacher led her to join the transnational socialist Zionist group, I apologize for the way I may pronounce this, Hashomer Hatzair. Thank you very much. As a shomer, is that correct? Shomer or scout. Then Bella Savitsky came to terms with the Great Depression by dreaming of kibbutz living in a future Jewish Arab worker state. She formed a lasting identity as a Jewish ethnic nationalist who embraced Marxist thinking, but not the secular sectarianism of the Communist Party. Second, as student body president from the all-women's college at Hunter College. It was all women, part of the City University of New York in 1950. Abzug saw great promise in the Popular Front, left liberal alliance she led on campus as a, quote, broad element, quote, in the American Student Union. A product of tuition-free Hunter, this coalition was interracial and civil, working class, and woman-centric in their approach to anti-fascist, anti-racist, and civil liberties organizing. Accordingly, Abzug developed a passionate commitment to multi-issue gender justice work, even if she was hesitant as a leftist to wear a feminist badge she associated with the National Women's Party. Third, Abzug purposely forged her legal career among political outliers in the National Lawyers Guild, a left-leaning bar association at the cutting edge of civil rights and civil liberties law during the Second Red Scare. One case in particular, Abzug's appeal of black Mississippian Willie McGee's rape charges, demonstrated how, as a left feminist lawyer, Abzug linked sexual freedom to racial civil rights during these years. While Abzug gained a reputation as a go-to political lawyer, her time in the Guild brought forward a healthy dose of frustration. Key among these were her inability to break through the male-dominated bar's hierarchy beyond the rank of Constitutional Rights Committee chair. After pressing for an end to Jim Crow and McCarthyism in the courts for more than a decade, she also began to doubt that courtroom action would bring forward more than just gradual results. Accordingly, Abzug was primed for a new theater of activism when she gained wind of Women's Strike for Peace. It was in her work with this group where we can see how prominently Abzug prioritized electoral and policy action over group theorizing and collective local engagement. Reporters often assumed that Bella Abzug was a founder of Women's Strike for Peace, which makes sense since this group effectively launched her political career, but was an inaccuracy nonetheless, one she rarely corrected. The fact is she arrived a week late and had trouble falling into line. On November 9th, 1961, she joined a small circle of women striking at the Soviet mission of the United Nations. As she marched, Abzug grumbled to herself and others, "This is all very good, but this is not the end of everything." She protested, "There's more to be done." As the mother of two young daughters, Abzug joined the WSP because she was deeply concerned about the escalation of US-Soviet tensions, more acutely displayed during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yet what set Abzug apart from most WSP activists was her immediate sense that they must join direct action with political action. She recognized many seasoned activists in her midst and believed that their image of concerned housewives donning hats and gloves while attention-getting was politically disarming to a fault. Rather, she compelled activists to take on a second identity, that of sophisticated policy experts. In addition to showing outrage, despair, and other important emotions, she later explained, she wanted the Women's Strike for Peace to have a process in which we tried to influence change through existing procedures and to change procedures that needed reform. Injecting the Women's Strike for Peace with a political jolt, Abzug initiated the lobbying half of what Amy Swerdlow described as their signature demonstration lobbying format. Abzug also introduced the idea that Women's Strike for Peace should advocate gender parity alongside peace, an element highlighted in the call for women's peace vote during their first peace pledge campaign in 1962. Why did Abzug believe gender parity should be a central concern? First and foremost, she and her cohorts discovered that women had been a decisive swing votes in some districts during the 1960 elections. Should the time come when we control that 2%, Abzug reported at the first WSP convention, our power would be enormous. Candidates would begin to eye our growing list with something more than mild interest. And, parenthetically, by the way, two members of Abzug's audience on this occasion were quite likely Casey Hayden and Mickey Flax. They attended the Ann Arbor Whispery days before SDS's Port Huron meeting, a link between Women's Strike for Peace and SDS, historian Andrea Estapa has recently traced. Abzug's view that peace women could and should shift the tenor of electoral politics also stemmed from her great enthusiasm for Eleanor Flexner's Century of Struggle, published in 1959. And here I'm just going to say, if you haven't read that book, you should. I believe it stands as the best book on women's suffrage even today. Excuse me for that. After reading this long and wide history of the 19th century suffrage movement, Abzug came to see the Women's Strike for Peace as a necessary continuation of early abolitionist labor, peace, and women's rights activism. By 1963 and continuously thereafter, she advocated within the group we should, quote, welcome the struggle for women to assert their rights and fight for emancipation and equality. Yet it would take 3 more election seasons for her to convince the WSP to forcefully promote women power is peace power. Thus we can see Abzug worked ahead of the curve in bringing gender politics to the peace movement. Where she hedged was in her lukewarm embrace of participatory democracy. And it is this point of friction where Abzug often found herself a lone critic within Women's Strike for Peace. And we can most clearly trace the roots of her occasional discord with later Women's Liberation Group. With its ad hoc convention, policy making by phone tree, and loosely appointed key women, Women's Strike for Peace was at the cusp of new left thinking on social decision making. Abzug valued WSP political inclusiveness, their receptiveness to grassroots organizing, and their elevation of women decision making. Excuse me. However, she also equated their purposeful, leaderless structure to a leadership gap that she was all too willing to fill. With the Americanization of the Vietnam War, Women's Strike for Peace shifted from its emphasis from nuclear disarmament to anti-war organizing, and with this shift, a faction within the Women's Strike for Peace increasingly promoted civil disobedience and criticized Abzug's political action program. Abzug scoffed at this opposition, testing her leadership. As she forcefully advised in her 1966 report, this protest against the war will remain a poll, a statistic, a fly in the ointment to consensus, but nothing more until there is recognition by peace pressure groups that public support they build for change must be channelized, use that word, directly into the American political power structures, end quote. We think of gender parity as a quintessential liberal feminist goal, but Abzug's purpose was entirely radical, even if cautiously pragmatic. After watching Senator Barry Goldwater capture the Republican presidential nomination in 1964, Abzug realized that this burgeoning conservative grassroots force must be matched by an equally engaged left liberal coalition. Still committed to the popular front politics that inspired her youth, Abzug sought to reconstitute this force by channeling the energy and ideas of a broad new left socio-political milieu into politics. Abzug's endgame was far-reaching: unseat Cold War liberals within the Democratic Party in Congress, thereby paving the way toward a new democratic order and transformative reforms that would make U.S. democracy more open, more responsive, and just. That Abzug helped forward a left liberal democratic insurgency that effectively took the reins of the Democratic Party between 1978 and 1976 is remarkable. That she envisioned women as the vanguard of this coalition sets her apart from other, quote, new politics politicians. Uniquely, Abzug believed women were best suited to push and push and push, not only for their own sexual and political freedom, but to break through the male military megalomania. This was Abzug's shorthand for the Cold War military-industrial complex, national security state, and the social failings of a war-mired liberal state. There for Abzug, legal feminism was one strand of a broader new politics vision to fundamentally rework American democracy in a more egalitarian and libertarian form. Harnessing the momentum, you can see where I am generationally. Harnessing the momentum of women's liberation, Abzug also wanted to bring feminists of all persuasions into the political fold. Women have always been, quote, the workhorses of politics, end quote, Abzug wrote in a once so titled Women's Liberation position paper, and we're expected to be the super creatures to get what is our due. Coming from this self-realization was an essential aspect of consciousness raising. The personal is political was a futile concept if the personal never translated into the political. Patriarchy would only end once feminist power brokers infiltrated and overtook the male-dominated political theater. These are the points Abzug pressed in conversations with Brown Miller and other proponents of women's liberation. Moving past critique to action, Abzug's congressional office in Longfellow building served as a conduit for feminist activists keen on realizing movement demands in tangible policy outcomes. We need to trace out this path, just as we need to reevaluate Abzug's radical pragmatic politics. Both efforts disrupt the either-or choice between radicalism and liberalism that has framed the trajectory of feminist history for so long. And on behalf of Leandra, I thank you. I'm scheduled as a commentator, and I'm not going to comment because I would rather hear your comments. But I can't help but saying, when you think of Patsy Mink, you know, the daughter of Japanese immigrants to Hawaii, is that correct? Her grandparents. Shirley Chisholm, a Barbadian American, and she saw herself as a Barbadian American. And Bella Abzug, a very self-conscious Jewish middle working class woman. Three extraordinary women in Congress at the same time. We'll think about that as we ask questions, have discussion, and when you raise your hand, just tell me who you are, and I'm going to move over so I can see. Questions, comments? Come on.
My name's Abby Scher. I'm from Brooklyn.
Yay! Sorry, Judy.
I like Brooklyn. I'm sort of interested in the intersection with the National Women's Political Caucus and the way these three women tried to enlarge their community, and the extent to which I know nothing about it, but that if they contributed to building out the structures through which women could more broadly challenge the political structures.
Well, in terms of Chisholm, she does. She actively participates in the conferences that the National Women Political Caucus had over, at least in the early 1970s. And she's continued, even when you look at Chisholm, when she goes to even kind of black feminist conferences and organizations, she's always encouraging them to join other kind of multiracial, intraracial, as well as multiracial organizations. So she's continued to kind of plead to black feminists at that time to join those organizations, and to say that you have to participate in terms of coalition building on every front. So the issue is, if you want people to help you in terms of fighting against kind of forced sterilization, you need to also create coalitions to work with other kind of white feminist organizations and their policy agenda. That you can't, and she's saying this to both organizations, right? So she's saying that you can't argue that they're not supportive of our causes when you aren't participating in the movement together. So she's at least participating in raising the consciousness of the women around her, as well as trying to create bridges where they can see their oppression on multiple grounds.
Was Patsy a founding member? I can't remember.
No, I need to look into more of this. And actually, there's a panel at the next session, I think, on this topic, and I'd love to go. Unfortunately, I'm presenting on another panel. I believe she was really centrally involved.
Can you move the mic closer to
Oh, sorry. So basically, I need to do more research. But I believe she was very involved. And it's interesting because she's claimed as a feminist figure, and she eventually sees herself as a feminist figure, but she was elected before a lot of the kind of mass, especially women's liberation movements. And she claimed some of these same issues, equal pay, childcare in the 50s. So she was really an early, I guess, feminist foremother, but in some ways the movement catches up with her when she's in Congress in the 60s and 70s. So she's really, and when she enters, there's different generations of women's legislators. So Edith Green, the person that she co-sponsors Title IX with, she, you could just say, is a more traditional and in some ways more conservative legislator. And older as well. And so Patsy Mink in some ways helps bridge that older generation with this newer generation that's coming forth. Newer, not necessarily younger, but newer.
I'm going to just add a few points. There's one wonderful story that Gloria Steinem says, The Influence of Chisholm. She said, if you look at the pictures of Gloria at the founding of the National Women's Political Caucus, Gloria used to criticize her. I mean, Shirley Chisholm used to criticize Gloria when she would come into the black community wearing blue jeans. She says, you do not speak in the black community in blue jeans. And Gloria points out how she wore a dress to the founding of the National Women's Political Caucus. Of course, Belle Abzug is a key figure in it. And what is very interesting is the grassroots, the statewide and the citywide national political caucuses are much more feminist radical than Abzug. And if you read the minutes of the National Women's Political Caucus, it's sort of like, they don't like Abzug because they don't think she's radical enough. I mean, it's an interesting struggle about how things can develop on the grassroots as opposed to on top. And Chisholm was very proud that she brought Fannie Lou Hamer into the National Women's Political Caucus. So it hasn't been written about much, the National Women's Political Caucus. So tell your graduate students or some of you to start working on it and writing about it. The papers, I think, are at Smith.
Yeah.
Either at Smith, they're at Smith. It's fascinating, the fights that go on. Yes. Please introduce yourself.
Pam Moss, I live in Midcoast, Maine. If you can stay away from partisan politics, not that you've been there, but here's my question. If you think about the leaders and the women, we have so many incredible leaders on both sides of the aisle, so to speak. I'm curious as to what the three women that you folks represent, what kind of perhaps coaching, or what would they see as the commonalities, whether we're talking Nancy Pelosi or Sarah Palin? I know. I know.
I thought I was straight-faced.
But what would they see if you could imagine where they're coming from, and where these women need to pull together in order to create coalitions? Because I do think that there is a commonality among these women that doesn't often get presented by them or the media.
Well, I think what I mentioned in the beginning of my talk was talking about a large number of women walking out. I think it was about probably 2 years ago in regards to reproductive rights hearing that happened on the Hill, and no woman was on the panel. And it was actually a Democrat and a Republican woman who was a part of that committee walked out together, right? So I think when you do see the Women's Political Caucus that's operating now in Congress, you do see on certain issues that they are able to work against partisan lines. And I think Chisholm, specifically Mink, does it, I think, better than Chisholm did, in terms of really forming those kind of coalitions with people who she considered would be her adversaries.
Just out of curiosity, to follow up on that, do you think that's happening though more in the Senate than in the Congress?
Today?
Today?
No, I think Congress probably happens a little bit more than the Senate, but I mean, they are usually deadlocked on a lot. At least when I used to work for the congressional member that I did, he was a Democrat, right? But you know, there were times where people were able to kind of work collectively. But I mean, it was a while ago, and this new set of right-wing politics that's operating, I really don't see much hope for the coalition building that I think that you see during Abzug or Mink's or Chisholm's time. I think they really did work more collectively than you see them doing now. Yeah, of course, right?
I was going to say that, you know, childcare was a bipartisan issue. So there were people, both Democrats and Republicans, who supported, but there were also opposition across those parties as well. And I don't think the Democratic Party was necessarily an easy space for people like Mink or Chisholm. When she ran for office in Hawaii, she was basically told not to run, that the Japanese American men who are veterans, right, they can be the ones who represent the island and the community. But she should really take a back seat. So even in her own party, it's not necessarily a warm, fuzzy space either.
Yes. No?
I'm Risa Mednick, and I have very strong Brooklyn roots, so go Brooklyn. I run a domestic violence agency in Cambridge, so I feel the burden of our foremothers very strongly on my back every day. What I'm very struck with, kind of, you know, this sort of WWSD, what would Shirley do and what would Patsy do and what would Bella do, kind of mentality right this second, because we need them and we need to channel them desperately. I found it really interesting, Judy, that you'd never used the words Head Start in your talk. And I think that's deliberate. Can you speak to why?
Oh, I feel like there's a lot of things I didn't mention. But I think they were trying to get legislation for people who are not necessarily of a particular economic category, right? That there was policies in place to try to help disadvantaged children, although there was not enough in place. There was not enough childcare in place, and there was not kind of enough kind of quality childhood education in place, even for people who are seen as disadvantaged. But they were also trying to get this available for anybody who wanted it, regardless of their class background. And so they would always talk about Head Start, but say, well, let's broaden it and make it more publicly available.
And I think that we're caught in that now, and we're, you know, many cities, and certainly at a national level, we're talking about universal, you know, pre-K, and we're very much going back. And I think that there are certainly historical legacies that we need to remember and learn, you know, from Patsy's advocacy, really, to push that agenda forward very strongly. I'm also curious about what do we need to learn from Shirley Chisholm about how we need to organize now to rebel against the erosion of abortion rights?
Well, I think the way Chisholm did is, like I talked about, in terms of building major coalitions, right? And working across, inside, outside, and specifically addressing the issue of class, right? So
and that
Chisholm
needs to happen, but it needs to happen sort of outside of mainstream politics as well, because we know how hamstrung our politicians are once they get to Washington.
Yeah, so she was about organizing grassroots women, right? So every time Chisholm talks about abortion, reproductive rights, she's in many ways challenging the women in her community, right? She's challenging poor, working class, Black and Puerto Rican women. And she's also connecting reproductive rights to issues of education, issues of economic poverty. All of those things are connected, as well as maintaining everyone's right to be a mother, right? And specifically for certain people that we demonize where we don't necessarily think they have the right to be mothers as well. So that's what she does.
I'll just add, I think, and I'm a historian, so I can't say if Chisholm was alive, or Bella was alive, Patsy was alive, what they would do. But I would bet they would be furious at the gutlessness of even those who are sympathetic around the issue of women's reproductive freedom and what's being done. When we think that Shirley Chisholm took on the black, just everything that Zinga said, that took a level of guts, and she was really vilified for it. And so she would just say, we've got to, you know, these Congress people need spaghetti, you know, just stop having, you know, overcooked spaghetti backbones. Better get some courage or start electing people who've got a lot more guts. Yes, the woman in the blue? Yes.
Quick question on...
Please introduce yourself, though.
My name is Margaret Pateki. I live here now, but I actually was a campaign worker for Bella Abzug.
Oh, wonderful.
Back on the west side of Manhattan. And I want to comment about that, but I had a question about the daycare issue. I just saw a movie that said there was daycare for anybody who wanted it during World War II?
No, if you worked in the defense industry, it was the Lanham Act.
Oh.
Yes.
So it's just defense industry.
It was in the defense industries. Yeah.
But the whole issue of the radical versus the liberal and people organized outside of politics or inside politics, I think it's been one, I mean, it was really difficult in New York in 1970. My personal experience was I walked out of a Red Stockings meeting. People were arguing about 18 different things. Were you ideologically correct? And, you know, walked over to Bella Abzug's. And there was all kinds of things going on there between the men and the West Side Democratic parties did not want to see her elected at all.
Right.
And there was all kinds of issues there. But it just seems like that's still a problem. You know, how do you, and within 5 minutes of talking to somebody from the first meeting here, we were talking about Palestine versus Israel and how people get stuck on politicians who compromise. You know, and Shirley Chisholm never compromised. Bella Abzug was more of a politician who would compromise on some issues in order to get other issues moving forward. Or else I'm curious about, I don't know Patsy Mink, how she was on those things, but how you have, in researching their history, how you understand how they came to that conclusion to not be ideologically correct, but to be more practical and enter the political arena.
I'll just say one thing. And Zinga may disagree with me, but that's what sisterhood is all about. Chisholm called herself unbought and unbossed, and she was definitely unbought. But especially after 72, she was very much, quite often she had to go along with the Brooklyn Democratic machine, unfortunately. She made, the compromises she made when she was in Congress, I would call them strategic compromises. For example, John Conyers wanted to be the head of the Rules Committee, an African American from Michigan. Chisholm supported a Southern Democrat because she saw herself as someone who would need Southern votes when it came to domestic worker protection legislation. She was very criticized for doing that. She was very criticized when she went to visit Wallace after Wallace was shot. By the way, none of the white men running for the presidency were criticized, only Chisholm was. Wallace never forgot it and would round up votes from Southern, we could say racist, white politicians to help her get certain forms of legislation passed. Now, that's a worthwhile debate about being ideologically pure or being strategic. And I think I would argue, as to just follow up on what Zinga said, is Chisholm was just strategic all the time.
Yeah, she was. I think she was more, I think it does happen in 1972 after she loses, you know, or it wasn't really a, you know, she wasn't gonna win, right? But she also doesn't, what I say in some of the work that I do, she takes on the kind of role of what being a legislator is in 1973. More so if you look when she comes into Congress in 1968, right? So she really in many ways, and I think this happens for all of them, right, become indoctrinated, right, in terms of the political game. And she knows that in many ways she can't survive if she was continuing to be unbought and unbossed. If she maintained that political ideology, which I say is a political ideology for her, it works to get her elected, right? It works to have tons of the press, you know, cover her. But in terms of in the rooms when she's trying to negotiate, it doesn't work. And so there's a political cost, right, to being unbought and unbossed. And some of her ego, because she had a little ego, right? Right? Some of her ego is about trying to negotiate that political ideology and what it means.
That's a really good question, and I still need to think more and do more research. But when Patsy Mink passed away, there was a conservative congressional representative, I don't remember the name, who came and spoke and said that she never gamed the system. Right? Someone who politically opposed her, politically didn't agree with her, but just said that she did not game the system. So she was not someone who's making backroom deals. And I think that's because early on when she ran for office, the Democratic Party wanted to pull out. And they said, you know, we'll have a better chance if we have a male candidate. She said, you know, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go with what I believe. No, I would like to believe that that was all the case all the time, but I don't know that that is really the case. There's a film about Patsy Mink called Ahead of the Majority, and that's from a speech that she wrote. And I love that phrase, ahead of the majority, which is that to say that she wants to identify a position that she thinks is right, to correct all the problems that you identified, that Chisholm identified, and that she was going to hold to that, even if that was not popular, even if that was not going to get her elected, but she really wanted to push those positions. So that's my hope, is that it's going to carry throughout, that perception of her will carry throughout my research about her.
I could also be wrong, just one thing about Abzug, but I think of all the three women, and probably of that generation of women who get elected in the 70s, Abzug was the most confrontational. I mean, she would say, I love them, outrageous things. Some legislator in the 70s introduced legislation hoping to make adultery a capital offense. And she gets on the halls of Congress and says, I'm all for it, but we'll begin with members of Congress first. I mean, which I would vote for that too, but, and I think she had the shortest career in Congress, if I'm not mistaken. When does Bella Abzug step down? She's out of Congress
76.
Yeah, and Chisholm stays on till 82, and Patsy...
She lost in 76 as well, but she came back in 1990
right.
and passed away in 2002. And actually, after she passed away, people in Hawaii elected her to Congress again.
Wow.
After she passed away.
Wow.
Yes.
Again, I
Your name?
but noticed that
Sorry, your name.
Oh, it's Pam Moss from Alton, Maine.
Oh, yes, of course, sorry.
Because of the fact that I live in Maine now, I've become very aware of the legacy of Margaret Chase Smith. And what has really been an amazing awareness. I mean, I was aware of her when I was a child because, well, who wasn't? But one of the things that I think of as Margaret Chase Smith is being very collegial, even though she didn't serve, well, a little bit of overlap. She didn't serve with these women. But I think it's interesting that we are reflecting throughout this conference, Democrats, liberal women, and I get why that would happen, but I do think that there are some women who were Republicans that actually bring an important part of history to feminism, and she's one of them.
Did she identify as a feminist? I don't think so.
Well, I don't think we have...
She was the first woman, by the way, to be nominated by a major party.
Right.
It was not Shirley Chisholm.
Yeah.
And frankly, she didn't pull out of them when the Republicans tried to get her to pull out. She says, no, I have an important role to play for women. So, I don't know that she ever called herself a feminist, but I think she was a feminist. She predated. Yeah, she really did.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long tradition of Republican women and Republican women in political office, and I think that has to do with the legacy of the progressive movement.
Right.
But then also the ways in which these women come into office, they're often sort of replacements for their husbands.
But she was the first woman to be elected in her own right to both the Congress
Yep.
and
Yes,
the
Yeah.
Senate.
she was.
Yeah.
She was.
After the first, anyone know who was first elected?
Yes, Jeanette Rankin.
Huh?
Jeanette Rankin was the first elected in her own right. To Congress?
To Senate.
Oh, the Senate.
would be her.
Or somebody from the West, somebody
From the South. I happen to be from Arkansas. It was Hattie Caraway.
Okay.
Very little, in fact, they're just beginning to celebrate her in Arkansas, but anyway,
Okay.
little known fact.
Yes, and you are?
My name is Jennifer Collins. I'm the executive director of the Courageous Kids Network, which focuses on children who have been abused and then also failed by the system. And trying to learn from these great women who have done great things, who have also fought for the human rights of women and trying to do that for children. Maybe, perhaps you have some advice for what I'm trying to do. Within the legal system, children are frequently ignored, and as much as this is definitely a woman's issue as well, because with custody, if there's an abusive situation, the abuser frequently is getting custody of these kids. But with what we are doing, and when lobbying and stuff, I, even though a feminist myself, steer away from the gender issue because otherwise we lose support. And within the idea of strategizing and trying to figure out how to make change, but being within your own, sticking to your own ideals, what would you have any advice, or as you know, focus on your research on these women as well? What have you learned from what they've done?
Well, if you, and everybody can answer that one, you know, all of you can.
I'm just remembering when I would, you would meet people who would come to offices to lobby. I don't necessarily think that you have to not talk about gender, right? Because legislative staff should be able to understand you as a constituency in terms of women or other organizations that you align yourself with that provides you maybe possibly more political clout than not addressing some of those issues of gender. I mean, it really just would depend on who you're meeting with and making sure that you understand their own kind of positions to strategizing what's the best kind of approach.
Because within the court system, what we find and what I'm seeing in all the different areas is that it's, well, if the woman lost custody, what is she not telling? Or is she crazy? Or this or that? So there's all this blame put onto these women. Are they not good enough mothers? Or what is a good enough mother? Whereas he's beating the crap out of these kids or whatever, sexual violence and stuff like that, excuse my language. But it's hard to try and, you don't want to lose the focus of the conversation, which is, the abuse of the children and protecting the children. So that's where I struggle. I understand what you're saying, but I still haven't quite found, I still feel that it actually weakens my...
Well, if it's about children, then it might just be better just because politicians hate to look bad in regards to children's issues. It might just be better just to advocate on behalf of children and not necessarily get into a conversation about gender at that time. I'm not sure.
And the
I don't know if I-
conversation you have with politicians is different than the conversation you will have with judges.
This is more of a complex issue because you get the judges in there.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have really good specific advice for you, but I'm thinking about the ways in which Patsy Mink brought issue to the fore, and she really tried to create as broad of a coalition as possible. One of the issues we didn't talk about today was the Women's Educational Equity Act, and that was to try to de-sex our curriculum, right, to make sure that we had new curriculum so that we're not reifying gender roles. And she worked really closely with activist groups, and even with issues like childcare, she held hearings, but she tried to create as much public awareness as possible about the issue, and then she tried to get as many people behind that issue as possible. That's a very generic way of thinking about it, but it really struck me as a very kind of feminist way of politically organizing, that it's not looking for that one person who's going to say, I'm going to change it, but she's really trying to build a mass movement.
Childcare, what is so extraordinary about the United States is we are the only sort of developed country in the world where the population is ambivalent about childcare for all. Every 5 years, there's going to be a study that shows that if you put your kids into daycare, they'll grow up to be Jeffrey Dahmer or something like that. And then it gets disproved. But disproving it is on the back page of the paper, and it's on the front page all the time. It's that's a long, complicated history. But the whole issue, what children are they the property of the men, are they the property of the state, and so forth. I think it's so historically fraught with the politics of the United States, and childcare is different than not totally, but the issues of custody are also profoundly complicated in terms of how it gets awarded and so forth. And in a sense, childcare is almost another issue. I just wanted to remind everybody that the childcare bill was also crafted by Chisholm and Abzug. And they were able to get this incredible coalition passed, and Chisholm and Abzug had sort of a complicated relationship, to put it nicely. And when Nixon vetoed it, Chisholm went into deep despair. She just said,
What are you going to do? What now?
And it was a child care bill that, had it passed, and it had the support of both parties, would have also said all women's work is valuable, therefore there's child care for the children of all working parents. It was gender, am I correct? It was not gender specific,
Right. Yeah, it wasn't.
and it didn't matter how much money you earned. So that the assumption was when you go to work, your children should be cared for by the state. And Nixon did that.
And it would
terrible thing.
open like at weird hours, specifically for women who were doing domestic work or working on lines, so it wasn't just a 9 to 5 entry. It was about, it allowed, it really was comprehensive in looking at the number of women it would assist.
One final question?
I want to say two things. One is, I wrote my doctorate on women during McCarthyism, so I have a sense of that Margaret Chase Smith era. And I looked at right-wing and liberal women. The League of Women Voters was the only national group to defend civil liberties, allied with the UAW, which was kind of mixed. So it was kind of interesting that it was liberal women's group. But the right-wing women, the leadership of the right-wing women's group emerged out of the right-wing National Women's Party. So the feminists had a reputation of that period of being right-wing, even more so than Margaret Chase Smith, who was not right-wing in that sense. So the politics of the women's movement leading into the 60s it wasn't a left-wing, it wasn't seen as a left-wing movement, although of course there were women in unions who were doing that work. But anyway, so I just wanted to say in response to that. And then the second thing is I just wrote an article in the Progressive magazine about, because I work as a journalist, not as an academic, about young feminist positions about Hillary Clinton. And they assigned this to me. It wasn't my idea. So what are young feminists saying about Hillary Clinton? And the young feminists who I called young women of color, white women on campuses, off campuses, of course they didn't want Hillary because they see her as the corporate candidate. And Elizabeth Warren had already said over and over that she wasn't running. And they all want Elizabeth Warren. They want the candidate who's going to be challenging corporate power and the status quo. But what Hillary Clinton has done, what her people did, is that they got the women of the Senate they got a petition together for all the women, the Democratic women of the Senate, to say that they back Hillary Clinton. In order to shut out their other women who are possible candidates. So Hillary Clinton is using her machine politics methods, and it's interesting because I was saying this in relation to another question about how do you do the machine and how do you operate in politics, and Hillary Clinton pisses a lot of people off because of this mode of operating, and I'm sort of curious to see. And she's she wears the mantle of feminism. But
That's a good question.
but people are, so there's this, it's just been interesting to watch now.
Well, what
happens.
It's like a new evolution. We now have a different kind of woman candidate. We didn't have that.
When Shirley Chisholm was teaching at Mount Holyoke, students asked her, what do you need to do to run for office? And all she said was money. And that is, I'm not taking a stand on Clinton one way or the other. She clearly is a corporate candidate. But she is the only woman in the pipeline of both parties who has the money to run for the presidency. The only woman in the pipeline. So I think some feminists are going to say, I would rather have corporate Clinton, because she's a woman, than corporate Bush, who's a man. But if you want to run for office, look at the number of millionaires that are in the House of Representatives now. It's all about money. And the whole issue of money became the issue after the '72 election. Clinton was called to task by the GAO because she spent $118,000 on her campaign, according to the FBI. I mean, sort of like you can't buy a button for $118,000. And they called her into question because she couldn't account for all her money. Well, she got most of her money the way we used to in the '60s. You'd pass the hat around, right? Well, if I'm going to pass the hat around to support my campaign, am I really going to write a receipt? I'm sorry, I forget your name, gave me 35 cents. I mean, come on. And those so-called reforms ended grassroots fundraising until the Obama '08 campaign. So unfortunately, 72 begins the total corporatization of electoral politics. And I don't want to end on that note. I would like to end on thanking you all for coming and channeling Patsy, Shirley, and Bella, Mink, Chisholm, and Abzug.
I just want to say one thing about election and politics. Patsy Mink's district was not Honolulu. So in Hawaii, Honolulu is the financial political center of the islands. So she represented the impoverished district, and she represented all the other islands. Wow. And for her to run the campaign, which is every 2 years, right? When you're in the House, you run the campaign every 2 years. She and her supporters would go to every community and do door to door. So I think it's possible to not necessarily follow the dominant pattern in politics.
Thank you. And on to lunch. And to shamelessly hawk my book. It's really good. Of course.
Are you going to come to lunch?
Yeah.